The wind carried her voice like it carried the snow that night, thin and trembling, barely louder than the crackle of flame. "May I warm up by your fire?" And when Thomas Whitfield turned to see who had spoken, he found a woman half frozen, bleeding, and running from something far worse than the Montana cold. What he chose to do in the next 60 seconds would alter the course of both their lives forever. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the second chances that arrive disguised as strangers in the night, I invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Now let us begin. The winter of 1881 had settled over the Montana Territory like a judgment, burying the high plains in drifts that swallowed fence posts whole and turned the cattle trails into white rivers of nothing. Thomas Whitfield had been riding for 6 days, alone, since the blizzard took his herd and very nearly took him along with it. He was 34 years old, a rancher by trade and a widower by cruelty, having buried his wife Sarah 3 winters past when the fever came through their valley and left him with an empty house, a half-finished barn, and a grief he carried the way other men carried rifles, always within reach, always loaded. He had made camp in a shallow gully off the Yellowstone Trail, sheltered by a stand of lodgepole pine, his small fire fighting bravely against a wind that wanted it dead. He was feeding it the last of his kindling when he heard the sound, not the howl of wolf or wind, but a human voice, cracked and desperate, calling out from the darkness beyond the firelight. He rose with his hand on the grip of his Colt, for these were lawless years in that territory, and a man alone in the wilderness learned quickly that kindness offered carelessly could cost him his life. But when she stumbled into the ring of firelight, he saw at once that whatever danger she carried was not the kind a pistol could answer. She was young, perhaps 22, wrapped in a torn wool coat too thin for the season, her dark hair crusted with ice, her lips blue at the edges. There was a gash above her brow that had bled down across her cheek and frozen there in a dark ribbon, and her eyes, when they found his, held the particular terror of someone who had been running for a long time and no longer believed that anyone would stop to help. "May I warm up by your fire?" she asked again, softer this time, as though she expected the answer to be no, as though she had already been told no by the whole world and was only asking out of habit. Thomas Whitfield had buried a wife. He had buried, in the years since, much of his faith in Providence and nearly all of his patience for strangers. But he had not buried the part of himself that his mother had raised on Sunday scripture and the conviction that a man's worth was measured by what he did for those who could offer him nothing in return. "Come on, then," he said, and he meant it the way a man means an oath. "Fire's small, but it's yours long as you need it." Her name, she told him once the shaking in her hands had eased enough to hold the tin cup of coffee he'd poured her, was Ruth Coleman, and she had been riding 3 days from a mining camp called Confluence, 60 miles east, where she had worked as a seamstress and laundress to the men who dug silver from the mountain's belly. She did not, at first, tell him why she had fled in the dead of winter with no provisions and a wound on her head that looked very much like it had been put there by a man's closed fist. She did not need to. Thomas had seen that particular silence before, in women at church socials who flinched when their husbands raised a hand too quickly, and he did not press her. He simply built the fire higher, gave her his second blanket, and let her decide, in her own time, how much of her story she was willing to spend. It came out slowly, over that long night, in pieces dragged loose by the cold and the firelight and the strange intimacy that exists between two strangers who have decided, without quite saying so, to trust each other until morning. The camp boss at Confluence, a man named Garrett Voss, had taken a liking to her the way a wolf takes a liking to a lamb, proprietary, hungry, indifferent to her wishes. When she had refused his advances for the 3rd time, he had struck her, told her she belonged to him as surely as the claim he'd staked on the mountain, and informed her that if she tried to leave, he would hunt her down and make certain no decent town would take in a woman with her reputation so thoroughly ruined. She had run anyway, on foot at first, and then on a half-lame mule she'd half-stolen, half-borrowed from a sympathetic stable hand, because she had decided that death in the snow was a cleaner fate than a life spent flinching. Thomas listened to all of this with his jaw set and his eyes on the fire, and when she finished, he said nothing for a long while, only fed another branch to the flames and watched the sparks climb into the black sky. "There's a kind of man," he finally said, "who mistakes a woman's gentleness for weakness and never learns otherwise till somebody teaches him different." Ruth asked him, quietly, if he intended to be that teacher. He told her he intended, first, to get her somewhere warm and safe, and that the rest would attend to itself in due time. Though something in the flat certainty of his voice told her he was not a man given to idle promises. They reached his ranch 2 days later, a modest spread called Whitfield Creek nestled in a valley where the wind broke gentler against the foothills, and there Ruth Coleman discovered the second half of Thomas's story, the half he had not told around the campfire. The house bore the marks of a woman's hand that had not touched it in 3 years, curtains gone gray with dust, a kitchen garden gone to weed, a rocking chair on the porch that nobody sat in anymore. Sarah's grave stood on a low rise behind the house, marked by a wooden cross that Thomas had carved himself, and Ruth understood, standing before it in the thin winter light, that she had stumbled not merely into a stranger's camp, but into a man's unhealed wound. She offered to leave when she was strong enough to travel, not wanting to intrude upon his grief, but Thomas shook his head and told her that a house this empty had room enough for sorrow and kindness both, and that he would not turn her back out into a territory that had already shown her its teeth. The weeks that followed unfolded the way frontier winters do, slow, hard, full of small labors that knit 2 lives together almost without their noticing. Ruth mended what curtains could be saved and sewed new ones from cloth Thomas brought back from the dry goods store in the nearest town, a settlement called Carver's Ridge 2 hours' ride south. She cooked meals that filled the kitchen with smells the house had not known since Sarah's passing, and Thomas found himself, against every guarded instinct grief had taught him, listening for the sound of her humming while she worked, the way a man listens for birdsong after a long silence. He taught her to ride properly, since her flight had been more desperation than horsemanship, and she proved a quick student, sitting a saddle with a determination that reminded him she was not the broken creature who had stumbled into his firelight, but a woman simply doing what survival required. It was not romance, not at first. Thomas would not have called it that, would have flinched from the word the way he flinched from most things that asked him to feel deeply again. It was something quieter and perhaps more durable. 2 wounded people discovering that another person's presence could make the wound easier to carry. Ruth, for her part, watched him work the ranch from dawn till dusk, mending fences, breaking the few horses that remained to him, riding out in all weather to check on cattle scattered by the storm, and she came to understand that his silence was not coldness but a kind of penance, a man punishing himself for a death he could not have prevented, as though grief unspoken was grief paid down like a debt. Spring was still a distant promise when Garrett Voss came to Whitfield Creek. He arrived on a gray gelding with 2 hired men flanking him, the kind of men who wore their guns low and their morals lower, and he found Thomas in the yard mending a section of corral fence. Voss was a broad man with a face that had once perhaps been handsome before drink and cruelty had coarsened it, and he announced himself without dismounting, informing Thomas in a voice pitched for an audience that he was there to collect what belonged to him, a woman named Ruth Coleman, who had broken a contract of employment and stolen a mule in the doing. Thomas set down his hammer slow and deliberate, the way a man sets down a weapon he intends to pick up again shortly, and told Voss that no woman belonged to any man who raised his fist to her, and that the mule, if Voss wished to discuss theft, could be paid for in silver, and the conversation ended there. Voss laughed, the ugly laugh of a man unaccustomed to being refused, and said that perhaps Thomas Whitfield did not understand who he was dealing with, that Garrett Voss owned half the claims in Confluence and most of the men who worked them, and that a small-time rancher with a dead wife and a borrowed whore had no standing to lecture him on what belonged to whom. The word he used struck the yard like a gunshot, and Ruth, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of voices, went white and still. Thomas's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did, the way a winter sky changes just before the storm breaks, and he told Voss, in a voice gone very quiet, that he would have one chance to apologize for that word and ride off this land, and that he would not offer a second. Voss did not apologize. Instead, he reached, slow and theatrical, for the pistol at his hip, the kind of move a man makes when he wants to provoke rather than to fight, certain that a rancher with flower-soft hands would flinch and back down. He had not reckoned on the years Thomas had spent, before Sarah, before the ranch, riding shotgun on cattle drives through country thick with rustlers and worse, nor on the particular steadiness that grief sometimes forges in a man who has already survived losing everything once and is no longer afraid of losing it again. Thomas's hand moved with an economy that startled even Ruth, and his shot took the pistol clean out of Voss's grip before the man had cleared leather, the bullet striking metal with a spark and a crack that echoed off the foothills. The two hired men, who had been paid for menace and not for dying, sat frozen on their horses, hands very visibly away from their own weapons. Thomas walked forward, picked up Voss's fallen pistol from the dust, and told him, in that same quiet voice, that he was going to ride into Carver's Ridge come morning and swear out a complaint with the sheriff there, a fair man named Augustus Reed, who had little patience for camp bosses who beat the women in their employ, and that if Voss or his men ever set foot on Whitfield land again, the next bullet would not be aimed at a pistol. Voss left with his pride considerably more wounded than his hand, and Thomas watched him go with the particular stillness of a man who has just discovered something about himself he had forgotten, that he was still capable of fighting for something, that the part of him buried alongside Sarah had not, after all, been the whole of his courage. The matter did not end so simply, of course, for men like Voss rarely accept defeat without seeking some manner of revenge, and 3 nights later, under a moon thin as a paring knife, Thomas woke to the smell of smoke and the orange flicker of flame against his bedroom window. The barn was burning, the dry winter hay catching fast, and inside that barn stood the 4 horses that were nearly all Thomas had left in the world after the blizzard's toll. He ran out into the yard in his nightshirt and boots, shouting for Ruth to fetch water, and together, the rancher and the seamstress, the widower and the runaway, they fought that fire with buckets hauled from the creek through bitter cold, beating back flame with wet blankets, choking on smoke that seared their lungs, until the bones of the structure groaned and threatened collapse, and Thomas had to drag Ruth bodily away from the open doors even as she screamed that the horses were still inside. It was Thomas who went back in, once, through smoke thick as midnight, and let out 2 of the 4 horses half-blind and coughing before the roof gave way behind him in a roar of sparks that lit the whole valley orange. He emerged from that collapsing barn with his eyebrows singed and his hands blistered raw, and Ruth ran to him across the yard and threw her arms around him with a desperation that had nothing left of caution in it, sobbing into his smoke-blackened shirt that she had been so afraid, so terribly afraid, and Thomas, who had not held another living soul close in 3 long years of grief, found his own arms closing around her with an instinct older than thought, and standing there in the wreckage of his barn beneath a thin, indifferent moon, he understood with sudden and total clarity that he had, somewhere in the quiet accumulation of ordinary days, fallen in love with the woman who had once whispered a single trembling question into his firelight. Sheriff Augustus Reed rode out from Carver's Ridge 2 days later, having already taken Thomas's complaint and begun his own inquiries into Garrett Voss's conduct at the Confluence Claims and the burned barn, along with 3 witnesses willing now to speak of Voss's cruelties once they saw a rancher brave enough to stand against him, gave the sheriff cause enough to ride to Confluence himself with a warrant for arson and assault. Voss did not surrender quietly, and the fight that followed at the mining camp cost him his liberty and very nearly his life, but caused no further harm to Whitfield Creek, and within a fortnight the matter was settled the way frontier justice, slow and imperfect as it was, sometimes managed to settle things rightly. Garrett Voss would spend the better part of a decade in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, and the women of Confluence Camp, Ruth among them in spirit if no longer in person, were free of his shadow at last. Thomas rebuilt his barn through that spring with timber hauled down from the foothills, and the help of neighbors who came once word spread of what kind of man he'd shown himself to be, and Ruth stayed through every day of the building, bringing water to the men, mending what needed mending, planting a garden in soil that had lain fallow since Sarah's death, until the ranch began to look, for the first time in 3 years, like a place where life was lived rather than merely endured. It was on a warm evening in late May, with the new barn standing pale and fresh-cut against the green hillside, that Thomas finally found the words he had been circling for months, and told Ruth standing beside Sarah's grave that he did not believe loving her was a betrayal of the wife he had buried, but rather a kind of honoring. That Sarah herself had been the gentlest soul he'd known and would never have wished him to spend the whole of his remaining years alone in an empty house, and that he was asking, with whatever clumsy courage a heart long closed could muster, if Ruth would consider making that house full again. Ruth, who had once asked only for the warmth of a stranger's fire, wept and said yes before he had even finished the question, and the two were married that autumn in the small clapboard church at Carver's Ridge, with the whole valley turning out to witness a love that had been forged, quite literally, in fire and frost, and the simple, stubborn decision of one man not to turn a freezing stranger away. Now, dear friends, I would love to know, where in the world are you watching this story from tonight? And what lesson did Thomas and Ruth's journey leave stirring in your heart? Was it the courage to show kindness to a stranger? The reminder that grief need not be the end of love? Or perhaps the truth that justice, however slow, finds its way to those who stand firm? Whatever it was, I would be so grateful if you shared it in the comments below. If this story of frost and firelight, of sorrow transformed into second chances, touched your heart even a little tonight, please take a moment to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale of courage, faith, and redemption from the old frontier. Until then, may your own fire always have room enough for one more soul in need of its warmth.